Who's our first speaker of the evening, and hopefully he doesn't perseverate too much. All three speakers tonight have specifically written me out an introduction, so I'm going to read them for you because they've taken the time to do that. Skylar Garcia is a new member of Toastmasters, and he will be presenting speech number 2 from the Competent Communicator book this evening. The speech is entitled, "The Best Glass Ever." Welcome, Skylar.
"I don't know if this is a good idea," said Jeff. You'll be fine, said my flatmate Brian. "We've done this a couple of times, you'll be fine." Jeff was putting on his second sweatshirt and his second pair of sweatpants, and my friend Brian was proceeding to wrap his arms with saran wrap and his body with saran wrap. We threw 2 oven mitts on his hands and put a pair of safety goggles on his face. He grabbed one side of the cooler, and I grabbed the other, and we walked down the stairs onto the lawn. My friend Brian, in his hands were pots and pans. He had cookie sheets, anything that he could carry that would hold just a little bit of water. And we went out onto the grass. Brian said, "You'll be fine, Jeff, you'll be fine." There was a pale look on Jeff's face. It all started when I was 16. With my father being who he was, I easily got a job working in the orchards, swamping cherries, running crews, fixing sprinkler lines, a typical summer job for a 16-year-old. I really enjoyed working in the orchards. At the end of the season, we had some leftover cherries, and I decided, let's make some cherry cider out of these cherries. Wouldn't that be wonderful? What's the difference between cider and wine? Just a little bit of culture. That's the only difference between cider and wine. You add the yeast, and the cider becomes wine. That was my first foray into winemaking. The first wine I ever made turned out awful. It was absolutely awful. I had used baker's yeast instead of a specialized wine yeast. This thing turned anaerobic, which means it turns into vinegar. And it was really, really nasty. It was the most awful wine ever. Over the course of a couple of years, I refined my winemaking techniques and learned how to make really tasty wine. I was at college, and I came back to swamp cherries. It was a 2-week season, swamping cherries every year, and by this time, the managers and everybody in the orchards had depended on me to help them run crews. I decided this year I was going to make a sparkling peach wine. I'd never made an effervescent wine before. And if you know anything about effervescent wine, you have to let it carbonate just a little bit inside of the bottles. That makes the effervescent wine. My best friend was getting married back in Pullman. So what I had to do is I had to go back to Pullman, see him get married, and go through the whole process. You know how it's always a week-long process whenever you get married? So I was helping him through the entire thing. I was back there in Pullman, and I got a phone call from my father. And he says, "Son, there's something going on in my shop. I'm hearing some popping noises, and I don't think it's a good thing." I came home that weekend and learned that my wine bottles had started exploding. I had them over in a corner. And in that corner there was wine seeping down. There was glass, and it was embedded in the walls. And I was nervous because I knew that these wine bottles could not stay there. They had to go back to college with me. I went inside, and I put on 3 pairs of sweatpants, my galoshes. I put on 3 sweatshirts, the thickest coat I possibly could, 2 oven mitts on my hands. And then I thought, whoa, what about my face? I gotta do something about my face. There was a refrigerator box, and I started cutting on this refrigerator box and layering the cardboard one on top of the other. Took my safety goggles and I traced it out, and then I cut that section out and put the safety goggles in there. The strap held on the cardboard and my safety goggles, and I went into the shop worried, just worried. It was like a hazmat suit, is what it looked like. I was worried that the wine bottles were going to explode, and they were going to explode in my face, and I didn't want that at all. I walked up to the wine bottles very carefully, and I took the first one. I picked it up, and I set it inside a Coleman cooler. One of those old Coleman coolers, you know, with the metal on the outside? Set it in there. Took my second one, and I set it in there. And my third one, and I set it in there. By the time I got to the fourth one, I picked it up, and I heard coming from the wine bottle. And I turned pale white, just holding it there in my hand. Very carefully, I set it in the cooler, and I proceeded to put all the remaining wine bottles into the cooler. As soon as I had done that, I put the lid on it, and I locked it down, and I put duct tape all around it. I was so worried that the whole thing was just going to explode, like it was an exploding Coleman cooler bomb. I put it in my car, and I drove back to Coleman. That cooler sat for a while. I was worried about the wine bottles. I was worried about them exploding, and I didn't want to open it whatsoever. Wine typically takes 6 months to a year to really develop its floral notes and its character, so you have to let it age. A good wine is always aged. I had pulled out a wine bottle, and I had tried to open it in my kitchen. Terrible, terrible idea. I set it on the counter, I was dressed in the same garb, and I had undid the wire clasp, and it just shot up everywhere. There was no wine left in the bottle. It was so carbonated. It was behind my cabinets. It was in my drawers. It was on the floor. It took 2 hours to clean up. So I decided I'm going to open this outside. And I had opened a few bottles before. Jeff, this was his first time ever opening one of my exploding wine bottles. His hand was on the cooler. We set up an island of pots and pans and a little section right there where we could take that, the cookie sheet, and we could put the cookie sheet. Brian was in charge of the cookie sheet. We set the wine bottle right in the middle of a wok. And then I carefully crept up to it and undid the wire clasp. It shot up in the air. I ran back. Brian put the oven tray right there, and it showered down. We caught as much of the wine as we possibly could with all the pots and the pans. We did our second bottle and caught as much of the wine as we could. As we're sitting there on top of the cooler, wrapped in saran wrap, with a wine glass in our hand, drinking our carbonated wine that we had gleaned from all the pots and pans and cookie sheets and everything. To this day, my friend Jeff still says it's the best glass of wine he's ever had.